came, Iran is going to be attacked by Iraq, and I have to have a strong and modern army.
While the Shah focused on his foreign enemies, Savak, his intelligence agency, was losing sight of the real threat closer to home. The oil wealth had mainly benefited a small group close to the Shah. The gap between rich and poor was becoming a gulf. In Najaf, Ayatollah Khomeini sharpened his pen.
The Shah has been talking about progress for more than 10 years. But the majority of people are engulfed in poverty and misery. He has beautified Tehran on the surface and has built multi-story buildings for himself and his cronies. But in villages where the majority of people live, they don't even have the most basic standard of living.
Foreign intelligence organizations were seemingly oblivious to the grievances building up within Iran. The CIA was much more interested in what was going on in its northern neighbor, the Soviet Union.
The reading from Washington was that the Shah was completely in control, that there was no great threat to his rule, and we didn't have to pay much attention to that. And I realize for Iranians, this is impossible to believe. I mean, that the Americans were not worried about all of the little things that were going on inside Iran. For the most part, we really were not interested at all. Iran was a base from which we could watch a lot of other things going on, but it was not we were not particularly interested in the domestic operations in Iran itself.
The world was, though, keenly interested in the price of oil. The Shah resisted all efforts to get him to bring down the price. Instead, he urged the West to cut back on its consumption, a message well ahead of its time.
Since we have a very nasty climate, why do you say that we should suffer this kind of discomfort and this kind of...
Well, you call that discomfort, but do you know that you can get 70,000 derivatives from oil? Is it right to waste it? What couldn't we do with those 70,000 derivatives? Your fathers and forefathers lived, and probably they were as strong as you are, and their houses were either heated with coal or not heated at all. But in any way, you are just wasting this precious stuff.
The dollar, in particular, was hit hard by the high price of oil. Yet the Shah continued to enjoy Nixon's support.
The American government tried to get him to moderate the price of oil following the big increase in 1973. And we never succeeded in gaining any moderation on that score at all.
Then, in 1975, the tide began to turn.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
Presidential candidate Jimmy Carter criticized the Nixon administration for ignoring human rights abuses and selling weapons to dictatorships. Iran was one of those he singled out.
Iran is going to get 80 F-14s before we even meet our own Air Force orders for F-14s. And the shipment of Spruance-class destroyers to Iran are much more highly sophisticated than the Spruance-class destroyers that are presently being delivered to our own Navy. This is ridiculous, and it ought to be changed.
After he became president, he realized fairly quickly that the United States relied on the Shah, that we had tremendous political, military, and economic relations with Iran. What it did do, however, is that it opened up a lot of expression in Iran. Because for the first time, Iranian dissidents, people who were opposed to the Shah, thought that they had an ally in Washington, and they were speaking far more freely.
In 1976, the CIA released a psychological profile of the Shah in which he was described as a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac who was likely to pursue his own aims in disregard to the interests of the United States.
ذهنیت ما درست یا غلط این بود که آمریکا حامی شاهه، یعنی اون به واسطه این حمایته که این قدرت از خودش نشون میده. حالا شما ببینید یه رئیس جمهوری اومده که اولین شعارش علیه، یا حالا یه شعار مهمش یه جوریه که میشه علیه این رژیم اونو تفسیر کرد. اصلا خود این روحیه بخش میشه که آقا پشت طرف داره چی میشه؟ خالی میشه.
Accepting the new reality, the Shah's government gave in to American demands for more freedom of expression and respect for human rights. But democracy was still a step too far.
Do you foresee a time when when Iran might return to a multi-party system? Is this a temporary measure to meet a crisis, or do you think this is the kind of political system best suited to your country more or less permanently?
All will depend on the will of the people finally, because I'm not eternal, and there will be the after me time. But I think that we have just taken what is good for this country, and I even sometimes wonder if this multi-party system is good for those who have it elsewhere.
After nearly 13 years, the Shah replaced his Prime Minister, Hoveyda, with Jamshid Amuzigar. Then, when Iran's Arab neighbors lifted the oil boycott, the price of oil fell and the bonanza was over. The Shah continued to expand the army, but most of his ambitious industrial and economic projects were stalled.
This came to a bad moment when oil prices leveled off in 75, and the boom that they had created in Iran began to stagnate or subside. A lot of people who had been called in from the village to work on construction projects were left without work, and I think it provided a kind of tinder for the revolution that was to come.
On the 31st of December 1977, Jimmy Carter and his wife celebrated the New Year in Iran.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you.
I watched President Carter on TV toasting the Shah on New Year's Eve and thought it was one of the silliest things I had ever seen, especially when the Shah lifted his champagne glass. And I thought, we're in a Muslim country. He's celebrating an American holiday by toasting with alcohol. Isn't this dumb? Doesn't he know anything about his own country or the people in his own country?
Within a week of President Carter's visit, the Shah made what may have been the biggest mistake of his reign. Ayatollah Khomeini's son had died in mysterious circumstances in Najaf 2 months earlier. The word on the street was that Savak, acting on the Shah's orders, had killed him. Hoveyda, the former Prime Minister, was given the task of planting an article in the press rebutting the claims. It was the first mention of Ayatollah Khomeini's name in a national newspaper since his expulsion in 1964. The article accused Ayatollah Khomeini of being an anti-revolutionary agent of the British. It had an incendiary effect. Thousands of protesters poured onto the streets. It wasn't just Tehran. Chanting crowds emerged in several cities. The name on their tongues, Khomeini.
I think most